After an initial GPU launch and when looking at what to buy, it becomes less about the core chip from the likes of AMD or Nvidia and more about what the partner brands can bring to the table. Be that a factory overclock, improved cooling solution, or something as simple as a bundled game to make their product stand out from the competition. Of course, we already know that the RTX 5060 Ti is a powerful card and is proving popular with gamers, largely due to its affordability as one of the more budget-friendly RTX cards on the market. Well, today we're taking a look at an ARGB OC model from PNY, and I'm eager to see if this card can stand out from the crowd, as the more affordable cards are usually quite similar to each other compared to the more higher end cards, where a percentage difference in performance can be, I guess, much more noticeable. When it comes to custom cards, it isn't too complicated to find one that best suits your needs. Obviously, the biggest one is budget, followed by cooling and power delivery. So if a card fits what you want to spend, it comes down to if the card can stay cool, quiet, and keep its boost clocks as high as possible for a longer period of time. Of course, aesthetics are also a big factor for many people too, but perhaps less so than all-out performance and cost. That, I guess, brings me to what we're looking at today, with the PNY eTeknix ARGB OC. As we know, PNY is well known for creating practical, efficient designs that deliver the full advertised performance without all that unnecessary bulk or complexity. And that's often reflected in the retail price too, which should make this one an attractive option for gamers. So have PNY got a strong card that ticks all the right boxes? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we dive into all of that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Doc, you gotta help me. I can't land a single shot. 1080p, 30 Hertz. Andy, I'm afraid you're suffering from a severe case of suboptimal hardware. What? What you need is the Philips Evnia 27M2 N8500. 1440p, 360 Hz, display HDR True Black 400, lightning fast 0.03 millisecond response time, and a true 10-bit QD OLED display. You'll be popping headshots in no time. It's beautiful. Let's see how I do. This might be terminal. Next level gaming with Philips Evnia, skill not included. Find out more by clicking the link in the description below.
So straight off the bat, for a 5060 Ti, you'll notice that triple fan cooler design, which is important because at $499, it's one of the, let's say, better priced cards available right now. Though that does still put it $70 more expensive than MSRP, with some AIB cards also matching the price, but for a dual fan version. So things are off to, let's say, a good start, especially when you factor in added RGB and a slight factory boosted overclock, now pushing 2692 MHz. So you could argue the extra cost has gone into a multitude of areas. This is also the 16 gig model, which accounts for something, as while they do have an 8 gig SKU featuring the same cooler, as per some of our previous content, we're always going to steer you kind of away from that in favour of getting a card with double the VRAM, making it the perfect card, essentially, for 1440p gaming. When it comes to design, I think it's fair to say that PNY has kept things pretty reserved. Of course, that's not uncommon for a card of this caliber, and adding an unnecessarily thick heatsink and more gimmicky features would see that price increase. And at that point, well, you're venturing into RTX 5070 territory, and I feel that that's not what this card is about. Now, the cooler is definitely one of the key features of this card, and that's because underneath, this uses the same PCB and clock speeds as the dual fan version. And the reason that's important is because if the dual fan version can handle things well, then the triple fan model should easily be able to deal with heat and noise levels as a result. Now, though it is a triple fan version, measuring in at 299mm long, 106mm tall, and just 37mm thick, it means that there shouldn't be any major issues with fitting it in most mid-tower PC cases, and even some smaller form factor builds without any issues. It's also a pretty light card, coming in at just 1,020 grams, which is, I guess, quite deceiving given, well, its length. The 3 large fans also give a little headroom for overclocking the card, with it coming with a slight boost directly from the factory. It can hit up to a 2,692 MHz boost speed compared to the 2,572 MHz of the non-OC variant, or any other base model on the market right now. And while a 120 MHz difference may not sound like a lot, it's enough to squeeze more performance out over the competition, and the price difference is, as mentioned, pretty minimal too. Now, the card is predominantly made from plastic, which isn't necessarily a bad thing given its price point, and PNY have given it a unique ARGB twist too, with a layout that forms the shape of kind of like an infinity symbol which passes through the middle fan and circling the fans at either end. Now, being honest, this card isn't the most attractive GPU that I've seen, but with a mixture of glossy black and matte black plastics, it's presentable and reasonably understated. And, well, the RGB will distract you from the plastics when in use anyway. What I do like is, I guess, the little details that join the fans together with some curved lines and angles in a shroud to just keep it looking interesting. And even though the shroud is made entirely from plastic, it still feels durable. And again, it just helps to keep costs more reasonable. There's a good amount of ventilation down the side of the card, though I'm sure this isn't from an engineering standpoint and just, well, happened due to the design instead. And being a 5060 Ti, it's not the hottest GPU on the planet anyway, so everything comes across as, let's say, suitable given the tier of card that it's made to cater for, especially as mentioned the fact that a dual fan version is available too. Now, one design choice that seems, I guess, a little bit odd to me is the single 8-pin power connector. Yes, it doesn't use the latest 12V 2x6 connector, though other AIB cards are actually the same. But it's actually more about the location. It's pushed quite far back to the rear I/O, and unless you have a grommet directly below your motherboard's HD audio header, this could end up looking quite unsightly. But given the size of the PCB, I can see, at least to a degree, why it is actually positioned there. Now, there is also a splash of more RGB along the top, illuminating that PNY logo, so if mounting the card horizontally in your case, it definitely adds to the whole gamer aesthetic, which I think, honestly, this is where the card is maybe firmly aiming at. One welcome feature is the good quality backplate, which not only protects the PCB, but also dresses it up a little too, giving us a more attractive look overall. And being made from metal, especially at this price point, is at least nice to see. It's a pretty simple design, and I feel it's more about substance in terms of cooling, which we'll find out soon enough. There's also a good amount of ventilation towards the back, allowing air to pass through the card, which again should help with cooling. And for a little more lighting, the cutout features a big arrow shape with RGB running around the edges of it. Now, the card being only 37mm thick means that it's a 2-slot design with a shroud that actually sits lower than the I/O bracket, and there is, of course, some more added ventilation, but also a selection of 4 display connectors. And while the card does have multi-monitor support, this isn't an RTX 5090, so multi-monitor gaming likely isn't the goal, but I guess it does make it perfect for productivity if that's what you're after. Now, tearing the card down is, well, pretty easy, with 2 screws holding the backplate onto the heatsink, while the 4 surrounding the GPU core pass through the PCB, allowing the heatsink to essentially sandwich on top of the core. Once this has been removed, it really gives you a much better idea as to, well, how tiny the PCB is, coming in at just 144mm, which is something we've actually grown to expect on the latest generation of NVIDIA-based graphics cards. But considering this one has, well, quite a large cooler in comparison, it does look a bit overkill, especially as we see that the PCB has quite a lot of blank space on it between the core components and the MCU that's capable of handling the RGB lighting for the card. There are some more screws holding the fan shroud to the heatsink, which makes it easier for cleaning if that's what you're hoping to do, but I'm sure that isn't the, well, exact intention. Now, the heatsink spans the full length of the card and includes 4 copper heat pipes that pass through your GPU's cold plate, which makes direct contact, albeit slightly off-center to the actual GPU core. The plate surrounding this makes contact with the memory ICs and some of the circuitry, but there's also some smaller areas on the heatsink that are separate to this that also help to assist in cooling the power delivery system. Another look at the backplate shows that it's not all for show, even with that extra lighting, but instead does feature 2 heat pads for transferring heat away from the memory that's on the rear of the PCB. For power, the card uses a 5+2 setup with Vishay SiC653A DOCTIMOS 50A phases for the GPU core, in collaboration with the Alpha and Omega AOZ 73004 CQI controller, and also uses Sinopower SM7341 EKH dual N-channel MOSFETs for the memory, which are typically rated for up to 44 amps each. And these operate under the UPI semiconductor UP7222 DC-to-DC buck controller. There's also a GS-Tech GS9221 synchronous buck converter rated for output current of 6 amps. though this is likely used for other auxiliary power on the card or for the I/O voltage rail for the GDDR7 memory chips. Now, speaking of the memory, there are 4 2GB GDDR7 ICs on the front of the card and another 4 on the rear in a kind of stacked formation, and are made by Samsung with K4VAF325ZC-SC28 markings, like we've seen on other 50 series GPUs from a variety of AIB partners. Now, due to the size of the PCB in relation to the overall cooling solution, I'm actually expecting good things from this card in that department. But first, let's talk about the overclock. Though this card does come pre-factory overclocked, we're actually able to push things quite a lot further, with an extra 320MHz on the core, along with the memory seeing the max increase, and also the power limit allowing an additional 10%. What this means for the clock speeds themselves is that we saw an increase in clock speed from 2407MHz now up to 2727MHz, while our boost clock went up from 2692MHz all the way up to 3012MHz. To test power consumption and temperatures, as well as to test the stability of our overclock, we ran F124 on an hour-long loop to simulate a real-world gaming scenario. It's here where our stock results end up seeing temperatures averaging around the mid-60s for both the core and the memory temperatures. And with the temperatures being so relatively low, the fan doesn't actually need to spin up all that much, which is why we end up with an average fan speed of 1260 RPM. And then in terms of clock speeds, we see the GPU clock sitting around 2275MHz for the most part, which also results in the card holding an average total power of 160 watts. We then ran the same test with our overclock applied, and from these improvements, we see the temperatures around 67 degrees on average for both the core and memory temperatures, only sitting slightly higher than our stock results on average. With the temperatures only being slightly higher than what we saw at stock, it's no surprise that the fan speed also only saw a slight increase, with an average now around 1300 RPM. When we take a look at the clock speeds, we see that unsurprisingly there is a pretty decent jump in performance here, with an average clock now of 3050MHz. And with this increase in clock speed and the increase we saw in the power limit, we do see a higher power draw with an average of 170 watts, which is actually a smaller increase than I maybe would have expected. As we look at gaming performance and starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where we can see the PNY card is already ahead of the Inno3D card by 3 FPS, which is the equivalent to a little over 4% more performance. So we're already off to, I guess, a good start. But it is worth pointing out straight away that this comparison is, I guess, a little unfair, since the Inno3D card isn't pre-factory overclocked like we see on the PNY. So I guess this result is expected anyway. As well as the increase over the Inno card, the PNY also manages to outperform the AMD RX 9060 XT by a single frame as well. When we overclock the card, we see a pretty substantial jump in performance with an 8% increase in the average frame rate, now meaning that the card is able to outperform the RTX 4070 by 2 frames per second, which isn't the most impressive improvement, but given the price difference at launch, it's still pretty nice to see. Moving over to Black Myth Wukong, we actually see the Inno3D card managed to take a step ahead of the pre-factory overclocked PNY with a single FPS between them, so all falls within margin of error anyway. The overclock is again a pretty substantial improvement, going from 51 to 56 FPS, which is nearly a 10% improvement. And with that jump in performance, we now see the PNY is once again able to beat the RTX 4070, and again, it's only by a single FPS. Finally, for gaming is Cyberpunk, and here the stock performance of our Inno3D RTX 5060 Ti was enough to beat the RTX 4070 by 2 FPS, and the PNY card takes that even further with another 8% performance at stock over the Inno card and 12% more than the RTX 4070, which equates to around 7 frames per second. This also means that we see slightly stronger performance than the RX 9060 XT and almost matches that of the 6800 XT. Now, things get even more impressive when we overclock the card, as we see a 15% improvement over the Inno card and 6% over the stock performance, now giving us better performance than the 6800 XT and nearing the levels of the RX 6900 XT. All in all, the performance has been pretty impressive across the board here for a 5060 Ti with a modest overclock straight out of the factory, and having a good amount of headroom to push it even further makes it all the better. Now, our last chart gives us a quick look at peak temperatures compared to another 5060 Ti, and what we see is that, in general, across the board, temperatures were very much in control, with the highest temperatures coming from the overclocked PNY card at 68 degrees on the core. When talking about comparisons, we can see that the PNY managed to stay very consistent throughout the test at 67 degrees on both the stock and overclock performance on both the core and the memory temperatures, with that 1 degree difference on the overclock being the only outlier. When we compare the PNY to the Inno3D Twin X2, we can see that the PNY does run a little bit hotter, but not by all that much. And this is also not the most apples to apple comparison, since the PNY is pre-factory overclocked, while the Inno isn't. But it does go to show that the card has been pushed, which will of course increase temperatures, but then the larger cooler makes a big difference on bringing things back into line. So there you have it. We haven't had a lot of 5060 Ti's in, so it's been nice to look at something that pushes the boundary over a vanilla stock model. And it's clear to see that PNY have put some thought into this card, from the overall design of it, which is arguably overkill, and that's pretty clear to see, not just from the sheer size difference of the PCB, but also how a dual fan model is available. But then even beyond that, it seemingly looks like PNY used the same cooler for their RTX 5070, while the 5070 Ti actually uses a slightly thicker heatsink, but still similar fan shroud version of this cooler, which in all honesty is fine by me, as it does lead to overall cost savings that then get passed on to the consumer. Now, as mentioned, the large cooler may be overkill, but it does go to show that under pressure, it allowed the card to come in with very respectable temperatures, even when sporting that pre-factory overclock. And even once we were done tinkering with it to set a pretty impressive bump ourselves, that translated pretty highly to a large performance jump over the likes of the Inno3D Twin X2 card, which runs at stock clocks. This also meant that the card moved up in the rankings, taking the fight to other cards that launched at higher prices. And you could argue that's where performance of the 5060 Ti kind of should have been in the first place. But I guess it's nice to see some worthwhile gains, as I feel with both the 40 and the 50 series, we've got used to seeing much smaller real-world gains. So bordering on 15% improvements is definitely a key highlight of this card. Now, one thing that I did notice when looking at this card, which as mentioned is priced at $499, is just how close that puts it to the RTX 5070. Just looking around, I was able to find, admittedly, dual fan versions from the likes of Zotac for $539 on Newegg, but also open box and refurbished models of the RTX 5070, including PNY cards, starting at $479 for the more plain looking card. But then the ARGB equivalent, so this, but as a 5070, can be snapped up for $509. So really it's down to you if you don't mind having a refurbed card for around the same price, but getting a lot more performance. If, however, you're dead set on getting a new card, then I kind of feel that there is some definite value here. But I do want to see the price of this, along with all GPUs, come down just a little bit to where they really should be. As, well, they are in places still inflated. But with the current lay of the land, if looking at an RTX 5060 Ti and wanting a good, solid built card with RGB, great cooling performance, a pre-factory overclock, and a lot of headroom on top, in all honesty, this is actually a very, very strong contender. So there you have it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, we've got a Patreon where you can support what we do while getting access to, well, some really cool extras, including behind the scenes content, a super special area on our Discord, game nights, and so much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.